Hello and welcome. In this video we'll see how selectors work and how we can use them. We learn about the different types of selectors that CSS supports. We learned about the type selector, which applies style sheet declarations by using the HTML element's name. Selectors in CSS have spotty support with regard to Internet Explorer. Therefore, almost of the examples at this stage are designed to work in all of the browsers we reviewed. Don't worry. Advanced selectors are discussed later for those brave enough, or lucky enough, not to have to support Internet Explorer. We have already seen the type selector in use, that is a selector that references a type of HTML element. So let's continue our discussion of selectors with the most common and widely supported ones, class and ID selectors. Class and ID selectors are the most widely supported. In fact, they are as widely supported as the type selector introduced later. There are two types of selectors. The class selector, which references the class attribute used on HTML elements, is the more generic of the two, meaning it may encompass many elements in a given document, even elements of different types or purposes. On the other hand, you can use the attribute on only one element in an HTML document, so we use it in CSS to reference an element that is unique per page. Besides using it in CSS, you can also use an element's class or ID to access it via scripting language such as JavaScript. You can also link to the location of the element with an ID name using fragment identifiers. Anchors are appended to URLs to force a browser to go to a specific place in a document. You can think of the id attribute as an element's address inside a document. No two addresses can be the same. The class name selector begins with a dot, followed by the class name itself which you choose. In the preceding code, the class name selector is planet. The class name should be comprised of letters, numbers, and hyphens only, to provide the best compatibility with older browsers. Class names must start with a letter and cannot include spaces. The dot appearing before the class name in the CSS rule tells CSS that you are referencing a class selector. The dot does not need to appear in the class attribute value itself. In fact, it cannot, because the value of the class attribute is just the class name itself. When used in this context, the type of element doesn't matter. In other words, you can also apply the class to other elements. What if you wanted to give both a div and an image element the same class name and have a style sheet rule that applies to div elements, but not image elements? You can do that too. Limiting a class selector to a type of element is demonstrated in the following code. This code shows the combination of two types of selectors that you are already familiar with. The type selector you learned before and the class selector. When you append a type selector to a class selector, you limit the scope of the style sheet rule to only that type of element. In this example, the rule is limited so that it only applies to div elements and no other type of element. You can still create additional rules that reference other elements, such as a new rule that only applies to image elements with a class name of planet, such as image.planet, but the rule that you see in the preceding applies exclusively to div elements with a class name of planet. As you have seen, elements can also be assigned more than one class name. For example, class equals planet Jupiter. The value of this class attribute actually contains two class names, planet and Jupiter. Each class name in the attribute is separated by a space. In the corresponding style sheet, the two classes may be referenced by two separate rules. The two style sheet rules in this code result in the div element, with both planet and Jupiter class names receiving the declarations of both rules. If you're thinking to yourself that Jupiter looks like a good candidate to be an ID, there is only one Jupiter, but many planets, you're right. We'll revisit this later when we look at ID selectors. The class names may also be chained together in the style sheet, as shown here. The preceding rule applies only to elements that reference both class names and their class attribute. Unfortunately, Internet Explorer interprets chained class names per the CSS1 specification, which did not allow chained class names in the style sheet. In Internet Explorer, only the last class name in the chain is recognized. In the preceding example, Internet Explorer would interpret the .planet.jupiter selector as .jupiter only. While this has been fixed in later versions of Internet Explorer, it makes the use of chained classes unreliable if you must support previous versions, so while it is a powerful technique, it is best avoided by beginners. The consequence is that all elements with a class of Jupiter will be affected by .planet.Jupiter, even those that do not also have a class of planet. Whereas classes are meant to reference more than one element, IDs are meant to reference only one element in a document. Let's see now the ID selectors. ID selectors are unique identifiers. An ID is meant to be unique, defined once per document. Like the class selectors discussed in the previous section, a special character precedes ID selectors in a style sheet. To reference an ID, you precede the ID name with a hash mark or £. Like class names, this name cannot contain spaces and must start with a letter. You should use names that only include letters, numbers, hyphens and underscores for compatibility with the older browsers. Since there's only one Jupiter in the solar system, Jupiter Lens itself is a good example of the concept of an ID selector. Just as there is only one Jupiter in the solar system, the ID name Jupiter can be used only once in a document, on one element. Browsers are forgiving of multiple ID names per document as far as style sheets are concerned. However, using an ID name more than once in a document can cause conflicts with other applications of unique ID names. For example, ID names can be used to link to a location within a document as HTML anchors, or when referencing an element by ID name from JavaScript. When you have an ID name appearing more than once in the HTML document, on more than one element, the browser won't know which one you're linking to, or which one you want to refer to from JavaScript, and will generally select only the first element with the ID. Always use the ID name for its intended purpose, just once per document. An ID name must be unique insofar as other ID names are concerned, but it may be repeated as a class name, should you want to do so. It's generally best to avoid this though, as it's easy to get confused and use the wrong kind of selector, resulting in styling the wrong element. Although only one element in a HTML document may have an ID of Jupiter, the CSS may contain as many references to an ID as are necessary. The uniqueness rule only applies to naming the elements, not the references to them.